Also for inviting me here. I'm very pleased to be back in Berlin. I've been here many times and I love the city. It's a great, great city. I understand from football that when the referee draws the red card, we have to go immediately. But that's not the rule that you will apply, right?
Well, in that sense, it's a yellow card.
Okay.
The same.
Good. So I will be talking about stagnation in the Eurozone and the future of the Euro. So let me quickly outline what I want to do. First, I want to talk about the diagnosis of the Euro crisis, and I will argue that there's been a lot of misdiagnosis of that crisis. Then I want to turn my attention very briefly to the design failures in the Eurozone. And finally, I want to ask the question, how can we redesign the Eurozone so as to avoid all these mistakes in the future? And I will concentrate a lot on the last item there, the budgetary and political union, because that, I think, is key for the long-run survival of the Eurozone. Let me start with the diagnosis of the Euro crisis. If I were to ask you what explains the sovereign debt crisis that erupted in 2010 and culminated to 2012 better, public debt accumulation prior to the crisis or private debt accumulation? Most people would say it's probably public debt accumulation, since we ended up in a sovereign debt crisis. But that's not what you find in the data. Here I show you the following. On the horizontal axis, you can see the change in public debt in Eurozone countries during the period 1999-2007. That is before the crisis. And on the vertical axis, I show you the bond yields, government bond yields, long-term, which are measures of default risk. Right? And as you know, in 2010-11, they shot up in a number of countries, expressing the perception that lived in the market that these countries were having a significant default risk. So that's a measure of the intensity of the sovereign debt crisis. And what you see there is that the prior public debt accumulation has no predictive power, right? Does not predict in any way the subsequent occurrence of the sovereign debt crisis. In fact, what you can see is that most countries of the Eurozone were on a declining path of public debt. These are negative numbers. These dots are observations of Eurozone countries, and they were on a declining path. Now, let me turn to private debt accumulation prior to the crisis. So here I set out on the horizontal axis the increase in private debt in the same period, 1999-2007. That is prior to the emergence of the crisis. And on the vertical axis, the same long-term bond yields. And here we see, yes, private debt accumulation before the crisis is a much better predictor of the sovereign debt crisis, of the intensity of the sovereign debt crisis as measured by the yields. I could also have put the spreads vis-à-vis the German Bund, and that would have given the same picture. So it's private debt accumulation that, one can say, triggered later on a public debt crisis. And here, another way to look at this is the following. On the horizontal axis, again, the increase in private debt prior to the crisis, and on the vertical axis, the increase in public debt after the crisis. And you can see basically the logic of this: countries that experienced private debt accumulation later on were confronted with the public debt accumulation. So what's going on here? Well, no surprise, basically it's a classical boom and bust story that capitalism is endemic with. We have seen that so many times. Periods of boom, optimism, euphoria, leading people to accumulate more debt to profit from investment opportunities. And then when the crash comes, then governments have to pick up the pieces to save the system and take over the private debt, and then their own public debt increases. So that's my diagnosis. No surprise, nothing original here, just an application of a very old idea that you will find in classical writers that have been writing about this before. But unfortunately, policymakers have made, in Europe at least, a completely different diagnosis, namely, it's all government's profligacy. That government debt was increasing, therefore it must be that these governments are undisciplined and they have to be disciplined. And that's how austerity was imposed on these countries. Financial markets also pushed in the same direction. I will come back to that. And as a result, austerity in the periphery was imposed without a fiscal stimulus in the center. And as a result, economic stagnation set in the Eurozone. Let me show you some numbers on austerity. Here I use the IMF fiscal impulse variable, which is the change in the structurally adjusted primary balance. Right? Of course, I know there was some criticism about this measure, but it's as close as one can get. I suppose there are other methods like the narrative method that one can also use here. But I think what this illustrates is the idea that I just mentioned. Here I show you the cumulative fiscal impulse over the period 2011-2014. Basically the austerity measures that were imposed following the sovereign debt crisis started in 2011. And you can see then that in the Eurozone, the periphery countries were forced into very strong austerity, while the center, they could have done the opposite. They also did austerity, of course not as intensely as the periphery, but as a result, the system as a whole created a deflationary bias. I've said a few countries outside the Eurozone on the right-hand side there, in particular the United Kingdom, that is often said has imposed a lot of austerity, but when you compare the United Kingdom to most Eurozone countries, you find out that austerity in the United Kingdom was quite mild. And this, in my view, explains then the major phenomenon that we observe in the Eurozone, that is stagnation since 2008. Here I compare the Eurozone, the blue line, that's the real GDP expressed as an index, right? So the blue line is the Eurozone, and I compare it with the US, the yellow line, and also what I call EU10, which is the group of EU countries that decided not to be in the Eurozone. Right? So these countries that decided, we don't want to be in the Eurozone. Right? And you can see here a major difference. Prior to the crisis, maybe something structural, the Eurozone is just growing less fast. But what I want to focus on is the period since the crisis. In 2008, 2009, you have the Great Recession, and all these countries are hit by this Great Recession. And then from 2010 on, 2009, 2010, recovery everywhere, but suddenly interrupted in the Eurozone, which is associated with austerity measures that were introduced at that very moment. And that led to a double-dip recession. The line goes down again, which means the Eurozone went back into a recession, which did not occur in these other countries, right? So it's all self-made. The Eurozone countries have been shooting in their own feet by applying the wrong diagnosis and therefore also the wrong medicine, right? Similar story when you look at unemployment. Here I have the three groups of countries again. Eurozone, blue line, yellow line, the US, and EU10, non-Euro EU countries. And similar story, recovery from 2010 on in these other two groups of countries with unemployment declining, but unemployment continues to increase from 2011 on in the Eurozone. So that today, the Eurozone has a an unemployment rate which is almost twice as high as in these other countries. And look at the starting position in 2000. The Eurozone at that time had about the same unemployment rate as what we observed in the EU10. So, just in a nutshell, some interpretation here. The sovereign debt crisis that emerged in 2010 led to panic, both in financial markets and in Brussels. Financial markets were panicking and then pushed countries into illiquidity and some into insolvency, and policymakers were equally gripped by panic and imposed austerity measures, mostly in the problem countries, but also, en passant, in the core countries, right? They were also forced into austerity, and these reinforced each other because the Eurozone is quite an interdependent system, right? And leading to a double-dip recession that we have seen in 2012-13, and slow recovery, so that today we can say the level of GDP, real GDP in the Eurozone, is at the same level as 2008, while others have been able to get out of it, not in a spectacular way. I'm not going to say that the US, and I don't want to preempt on what is going to be said later, have seen a spectacular recovery, but if you want to compare with the US, then certainly it looks much better. Monetary policy did not help, and that is also a very big difference with the US. Here I show you the balance sheet of the Fed and the ECB since 2004, but then you can see 2008, this balance sheet shoots up in both countries, right? This is the banking crisis, and central banks correctly interpreted this as necessitating, triggering the lender of last resort function, and the balance sheet of the central banks explodes. Money base, which is the liability side, explodes at the same time. And then you see some movements all the way, but the important difference occurs from 2012 on, where we see that the Federal Reserve starts a massive program of QE, buying government bonds and thereby increasing its balance sheet and the liquidity in the system, while at the same time, when the Eurozone is in a double-dip recession, the ECB dramatically shrinks its balance sheet, takes out liquidity from the system. If there is a policy mistake, there it is. During a recession, taking out liquidity from the system. You couldn't do better in terms of policy mistake. Now, the ECB has learned, and starting from 2015, has announced and is now busy doing QE, expanding its balance sheet. But this is an announcement of an increase of 1 trillion, which means that it will not reach the levels that the Federal Reserve has been doing. It will be more conservative than what the Federal Reserve has been doing. But certainly, that's the right thing to do. Okay, let me go on. So, let me summarize this as follows. What this austerity program in the Eurozone illustrates is a failure to conduct fiscal policies that are right for the system as a whole. Nobody at the Eurozone level feels responsible for stabilization of the system. It's all one country affairs. So there is a typical fallacy of composition. You look at individual countries, right? And nobody is responsible for the system as a whole. And ask the question, are we having the right fiscal policies for the Eurozone as a whole? If some had the responsibility and the power to do so, chances are that they would do something different. Of course, you can say, well, when you're blind and do a misdiagnosis, you will also do the same thing. But at least institutionally, it would have been more attractive. And at the same time, monetary policy at a crucial moment was contractionary, and therefore the wrong policy mix was applied. And therefore also, it's no surprise that we are stagnating in the Eurozone. As I said earlier, it's all self-made. So that is what I want to say about the diagnosis of the crisis. It's a very sad story. Let me now talk about the design failures of the Eurozone, which it's even sadder story. What do I mean with design failures of the Eurozone? Well, here it is. I will focus on 2 points, which I want to really summarize. One has to do with the dynamics of booms and busts that are endemic in capitalism. That's what I said in the beginning. We live in a wonderful system, a capitalistic system. I'm not going to say that this is something we should push aside. I think it's a wonderful system, but it's relatively unstable. And it has this characteristic of leading to booms and busts. And one of the things that the architects of the Eurozone hoped for was that these booms and busts, once you are in a monetary union, would become booms and busts at the Eurozone level. And when they are the same, it's easier to manage than when they are different in nature. It turned out that they were different in nature. And as a result, major problems of adjustment occurred. I will come back to that to analyze how exactly these booms and busts differed as between countries. Second, design failure, which I will put a little more emphasis on, has to do with the existence of the absence of stabilizers. Over the decades, in many countries, we introduced stabilizers to deal with this volatility of capitalistic systems. And what happened when we introduced the Eurozone is that these stabilizers were eliminated at the national level and nothing was put there at the Eurozone level to take the place. And as a result, member states found out that they are naked and fragile, unable to deal with these disturbances. Let me expand on this second point a little more, what I mean exactly. Well, here it is. I think what was lacking at the Eurozone level was a lender of last resort in the government bond markets, not in the banking sector, because the ECB, right from the start in October 2008, was willing to provide massive amount of lender of last resort facilities to banks. No hesitation of the ECB to provide liquidity to bankers. Much hesitation for the ECB to provide liquidity in the government bond markets. In other words, the ECB distrusts governments more than bankers. I don't know why, but that's what we observe. Right? So this absence of a lender of last resort in the government bond market was a real problem. Why? Well, we have to realize that when countries become members of a monetary union, the governments, when they issue debt, have to issue debt which is de facto a foreign currency. That is a currency over which these governments have no control. As a result, they cannot give a guarantee to bondholders that the cash will always be there to pay them out at maturity. Contrast this with a standalone country, United Kingdom or Sweden or whatever. When they issue bonds, the governments issue bonds, they issue that in their own currency, the pound sterling, say, and the UK government can give a credible guarantee to bondholders that the cash will always be there to pay out bondholders in pound sterling, because the UK government is backed by a central bank, the Bank of England, that is capable and will be forced, if necessary, to provide the liquidity necessary to pay out bondholders. And so, therefore, the bondholders have a guarantee that they will be paid out in pound sterling. Of course, they have no guarantee about potential inflation, but they have a guarantee that they will be paid out in pound sterling. That's not a guarantee members of a monetary union can give. And as a result, self-fulfilling crises can occur, right? That typically have the same feature at a certain moment. For example, a recession. Government budget deficits increase, debt levels increase. Investors get nervous. What do? They sell the bonds. As a result, yields increase. But more importantly, in a monetary union, liquidity is withdrawn from the market and is moved to safe places, say from Spain to Germany, right? Within the same monetary union. So you have a sudden stop and a movement, massive movement of capital from one country to the other, destabilizing the country from which the money is withdrawn and creating a liquidity crunch since that government cannot rely on a central bank, it can be pushed by financial markets into illiquidity. A standalone country like the UK cannot be pushed into illiquidity. No market can make the UK government illiquid because there is a superior force, the Bank of England, that can produce all the liquidity necessary to make sure that the UK government will find the cash. That's not the case in a monetary union. And therefore, governments in a monetary union are structurally weakened. Put differently, in a monetary union, the balance of power is moved away from sovereigns towards financial markets. Financial markets can push any government of the monetary union into illiquidity and insolvency without any of these governments being able to protect themselves, at least if the others are not willing to help out. I'll come back to that. And this creates, of course, a very fragile situation, a possibility where countries can be pushed into a bad equilibrium, because what do you do when you are pushed into illiquidity by markets? You have to impose austerity as quickly as possible. Raise taxes, reduce spending when in the midst of a recession, because that's when these things happen, right? It's in a recession that you find these things. And therefore, and then I come to my second point, all this leads to eliminating another stabilizer, the automatic budget stabilizers, right? The fact that when there is a recession, budget deficits increase automatically, and that's a good thing. It tends to stabilize the business cycle. But that is switched off in a monetary union when sovereigns are not backed up by a central bank. So here we have a structural weakness that has to be eliminated, otherwise we risk each time we are in a recession to be prone to these vast movements, sudden stops from one country, capital moving from one country to the other and creating bad equilibria, as I have described them. So how do we redesign this system? I'm going to talk mainly about the third one here, say a few things about the role of the ECB and skip the coordination of macroeconomic policies in the Eurozone. This is about time constraint. Already,
5 minutes.
I thought I had 30 minutes. Did I? Okay, well, I missed that. Okay. So yeah, the ECB. The ECB, it took some time for the ECB to understand this stuff. I think there is a rule of 2 years. The ECB needs 2 years to come to a realization. And it did. It did in 2012 when it acted, right? And the outright monetary transactions, which was a spectacular success when you look at the spreads here, right? Prior to the crisis, they shot up. And then the ECB announced its OMT, and the spreads declined again, right? Spectacularly. Without the ECB having to shoot. They didn't have to buy €1, just announcing. I said, it's like Deus Ex Machina, from theater Apollo at the end, comes from the sky and in Orfeo, and something like this. And the ECB just announced this OMT, and markets were pacified. They understood, yes, the ECB is willing to provide liquidity in times of crisis, so therefore we don't have to panic anymore, and spreads decline. So it's worked beautifully, right? It has been disputed in some countries. I don't know, I don't understand why, but that's the way it is. So let me turn to the final point, a political union, but I see that I don't have much time to say what I wanted to say about this. Anyway, so well, let me say the following. Budgetary union has 2 dimensions. One has to do with consolidation of government debts. So my analysis has been that one of the problems of the Eurozone is that governments have their own national debt, right? But it's not backed up by a central bank willing to provide liquidity. And as a result, it leads, in times of problem, during recessions usually, to a potential of sudden stops and movements from one country to the other. How can you solve this structurally? Well, by consolidating the debt, having a government debt at the Eurozone level, which is backed then by a central bank, very much like a standalone country. You really mimic what happens in a standalone country. So that is what a budgetary union does to you, right? And it structurally reduces this problem so that the ECB doesn't have to be there all the time to help individual countries because you have consolidated. And you avoid that within the monetary union, regularly there will be vast movements of capital when markets are afraid and panicking from one country to the other that destabilize the system. It also is a way to restore the balance of power in favor of the sovereign and against the financial markets, because that, as I argued, is one of the big problems of the Eurozone, this major change in the balance of power and making financial markets much more powerful relative to sovereigns. And the second reason why we need insurance mechanism, why we need a budgetary union, is because it provides insurance when countries are hit by asymmetric shocks. And that's part of I mean, this is something that you need to make a monetary union more acceptable for the people. Okay, let me, I will have to skip a lot. Let me say, let me return to these asymmetric shocks here. So what I did was to look at the nature of the asymmetry of shocks in the Eurozone by trying to disentangle the trend and the cyclical component of GDP. And what you find is that the correlation of the cyclical components of GDP is quite high. I was quite surprised to find that. 0.8, 0.9, right? So basically the cyclical component of movements of GDP is very strongly correlated. The only country that is not so well correlated is Germany, surprisingly. You would think the biggest country would be the leading country. No, it has been the outlier. But still, it's positively correlated. But that was a surprise for me. Now, the other point that I want to make is that when you look at these asymmetric shocks, you find out that the cyclical component is significantly stronger than the trend component, right? Most of the variation comes from the cycle, but it varies a great deal across countries. And in particular, when you look at the core countries, there you see that the cyclical component is much weaker, and in the periphery it's much bigger. And that you can also find in the following way. Here I show the business cycle component of GDP growth in the Eurozone. And what you see is that essentially the Eurozone was gripped by about the same boom and bust, but the amplitude was extremely different. Some countries, especially in the periphery, experienced a very strong boom and then a very strong decline, right? But it is not the story that you often hear in optimal currency area theories, that is that the correlations were negative, right? The business cycles were very synchronized, but was not synchronized is the amplitude. And that created most of the problems. What I derive from this as a general conclusion, that is that for budgetary union, right, that is that the cyclical component of output growth dominates, say, the long-term or the supply side structural movements, right, which calls for stabilization efforts, right? That's what we have to do. And we should strengthen stabilization of the business cycle relative to efforts that have been made to impose structural reforms. Structural reforms you want to impose when you have shocks that are permanent, supply shocks, productivity shocks, permanent changes. Then you have to adjust prices and wages. Then you have to be mobile. But when the shocks are typically business cycle, temporary shocks, then you shouldn't have more structural reforms or flexibility. That's when you have to apply stabilization. The point I'm making further on in my presentation is that stabilization at the Eurozone level can only be done if you do it embedded in a budgetary union. That's the key insight, I think, that we have. So there is a need for more stabilization. I'm not saying that there is no need at all for structural reforms. I mean, of course some countries have to do it. I'm thinking of countries where you have dual labor markets, where the young people cannot find jobs because the old people are overly protected. There you have to do something, right? So these are the structural reforms. Or in Greece, where you need a taxation system where the rich will also pay. These are structural reforms that are necessary. But we have focused too much on structural reform and not sufficiently, in my view, on stabilization. And stabilization can only be done at the level of the Eurozone. So let me conclude. The long-run success of the Eurozone, I think, depends on a continuing process of political unification. And if there's one reason why we need political unification, it's because the Eurozone has dramatically weakened the power and the legitimacy of nation-states. Right? I've argued that this has been one of the structural changes. It has reduced the power and the legitimacy of nation-states that cannot do what they were supposed to do in a monetary union. And while we have reduced the power and the legitimacy of nation-states, we have failed to create a nation at the European level that takes over these responsibilities. And nobody is willing to do that today. I have no illusions. Few people want to go in that direction. But that is the problem of the Eurozone. And this cannot last. I mean, we will have to move in the direction of a political union to re-establish the legitimacy of a nation, right, and its responsibilities. If we don't want to do it, then the euro has no future. Thank you for your attention.